The Haymarket tragedy is a series of unfolding events that results in this great trial and conspiracy, alleged conspiracy by radicals, anarchists, and labor leaders to commit violence and murder. The real conspiracy is against the workers by the corporate interests utilizing the state to basically crush the labor movement. And the way that it had been playing out is that the mayor of Chicago had little control over the police force because the police force, people like Inspector Bonfield and Captain Shack, were essentially in the employ of the large businesses, the Pullmans and the Fields and folks like that, who had organized law and order leagues long before because of this fear that workers were going to take over the country, if not their own businesses. But the Haymarket event is a great example of how this took place because as the story unfolded, and when Carter Harrison, the mayor, had ordered Inspector Bonfield to send his men home, he didn't. And Carter Harrison got on his horse and rode home, but the policemen stayed, who were lined up in formation. And in the end result is that the police attack the workers. And if you look at any evidence, which of course eventually comes out that there is no evidence that workers shot at the police, that workers were armed, but that the police were armed and all the bullets that killed the police were their own bullets. And but this is, I call it, the conspiracy of the state to try to turn it on its head. And so the next day, martial law is declared in Chicago after this bombing that took place. And it was all the illustrations, because there were no photographs, all the illustrations showed, a bomb flying through the air, showed workers shooting at the police, and this is what became published. And illustrations of crazy, wild-eyed, long-haired, radical anarchists trying to take over our society. That was essentially the picture that was portrayed. Of course, we've lived through these various images of the enemy over whenever there's a war or there's an event that creates strife in society. We create these images of the enemy, and this time it was the union leaders. And to continue this conspiracy after the event and after the trial, the unfair trial, one of the most unfair trials probably in the history of Western civilization, of which there are many, the heroes become the police. And that's why there's a statue that is created for the police where it talks about their being attacked by the workers. It still stands at the police headquarters at 35th in Michigan. It had been moved around over the years, but this becomes a struggle for 120 years as to are we ever going to get, or 115 years, will there ever be a monument for the workers in Haymarket Square? Lucy Parsons, of course, because it was private, was able to create a monument with aid from many others that was dedicated in 1893 for the martyrs in the cemetery. But the actual site, Des Plaines and Randolph, only contained for years and years and years a big police statue honoring the policemen. And so the story that this was really about a fight for 8-hour day, the right to organize, the right to peaceably assemble, and the right to even immigrant rights because of the German heritage of 6 of the 8 martyrs is one that was unknown to most of any Americans except everywhere else around the world. People knew about the Haymarket story. The story itself continues because the day after the bombing that takes place, martial law is declared, and anybody that's in a group of 2 or more could be rounded up. And in fact, over the course of the next few days, 200 union leaders are taken into police stations. Union halls are raided, and anybody that was considered a union activist was considered as a possible suspect of this conspiracy that the state started conjuring up. I say the state, I'm talking about the state's attorney and the Chicago police and the Tribune company. In fact, the Tribune even published something that said that they need to find 8 men who could be found as accomplices in this. My own theory about why 8 workers were picked out is probably has to do with biblical sorts of references, an eye for an eye. There were 7 policemen who died, so let's find 8 militants who we can use as an example. Instead of 7, 1 more. I don't know that there's any evidence as to why specifically 8, but because since none of these men were guilty of anything, which in fact the state's attorney essentially makes in his closing argument to the jury, which is, these men are no more guilty than the rest of you. They're guilty for their ideas and the men who follow them, and so hang them and society will be safe, society will be free. And so we learn from the state's attorney through his own words that this is really about ideas, about the fear that ideas can change society as we know it. And in fact, that's true. That's what our Haymarket murders were about, was trying to change society, to redistribute the wealth that workers created all wealth and they got very little back in the exchange of their labor for production. So this trial goes on for a couple of months, but it was a very dramatic trial because that night of the bombing, when Albert Parsons heard about it, somebody ran in and said, "Albert, you need to leave. They're going to come after you. They're going to come after all of us." And Albert Parsons decided to leave Chicago, and he took a train to Geneva, Illinois, where he stayed at the home of a couple of friends for a couple of days. Lizzie Holmes and her husband, she was an organizer. And he then decided that, based on the reports he was hearing, that he should go up to Wisconsin. And he went to Wisconsin to a farm where he knew people and stayed away until the first day of the trial. And a very dramatic presentation of himself to the jury was made the first day of the trial in June of 1886. The trial began, and the courtroom doors opened, and he walked in, and he offered himself up as the person that they should try and let everybody else go. And he clearly wrote about this, that he had felt that he owed this to his coworkers and comrades. The ironic thing is that some of these men didn't even know each other very well, but they were picked out and selected by the grand jury because they needed men who had demonstrated some degree of political activism. What we know is that George Engel was at home playing cards with friends. We know that Louis Ling was 3 miles away at the time of the bombing, speaking to another group of workers. We know that Samuel Fielden didn't throw a bomb because he was speaking and nobody saw him. Albert Parsons was at Zepf's Hall with his family. And so none of them, there's never a shred of evidence that anybody connected to these men had anything to do with the throwing of a bomb. Some suspect it could have been an angry worker. Some suspect that Louis Ling made the bomb, and that there was this whole conspiracy that developed that was presented at the trial, that the workers had various codes in the newspapers, and it's all became really mostly a witch hunt, but no evidence was ever presented that any of these workers were connected to a conspiracy to create violence, other than to have a peaceful demonstration, which is in the end why 6 years later the new governor of Illinois, John Peter Altgeld, pardoned them, because he actually read the record and he had been urged to do so by Clarence Darrow. I mentioned it was a dramatic trial, and you might want to just stop here.
All right.